Welcome everyone to What is Black, a parenting podcast that addresses issues important to raising healthy and thriving Black children and teens. I'm your host, Dr. Jacqueline Duche. On today's episode, we're continuing our discussion about reimagining systems and institutions to better serve families raising Black children and teens, with a specific focus on Black girls. According to data from the African American Policy Forum's The Facts to Know About the Status of Black Women as we enter the Biden year series, Black girls are 7 times more likely to be suspended from school than white girls, and 4 times more likely to be arrested at school. Black girls are over-disciplined and over-policed in our schools. To discuss this issue, I'm joined by guest Dr. Sheretta Butler Barnes, a developmental psychologist and associate professor at Washington University in St. Louis Brown School, and Dr. Valerie Adams Bass, a developmental psychologist and assistant professor in the Department of Human Services at the University of Virginia Curry School of Education. Welcome, Dr. Butler Barnes, to the show.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you for having me.
Since the last time we spoke, and hopefully our listeners will go back to the previous episode when we talked about colorism, and you were a guest on that show, they'll get this is a second treat for listeners to hear your words of wisdom. So thank you so much for joining.
Yeah, thank you for having me. I'm excited. Anytime it's an opportunity to talk about Black girls and healthy development, I am overjoyed.
All right, so let's jump right into the conversation. So on this episode, we're going to talk about over-policing and over-disciplining of Black girls. Towards the end of 2020, there were several articles that came out about this topic. Yeah. And then even more recently, recent reports of Black girls being over-policed. Mm-hmm. So I definitely wanted to have this conversation with you because of your this is one of your areas of expertise, but I was wondering first if you could share your research on the issues of policing and over-disciplining of Black girls and why it's an important topic for us to really be talking about and focusing on.
Yeah, absolutely. And so my research focuses on Black girls primarily in school settings. And then I'll talk about how that sort of feeds into like over-policing and over-disciplining of Black girls. And so within the school settings, I focus on the perceived treatment of from teachers, administrators, and staff who service Black girls in those educational settings, and how these experiences shapes and impacts their racial and gender identity in terms of who they are and how they define themselves. And one of the major things that I'm primarily involved in with this work is taking this work around them speaking about, the way that they're being perceived in the environment, how they're being treated, and allowing Black girls to define and tell their own story about who they are and how they show up. And so through this work, in relation to over-policing and over-disciplining, I found that Black girls have mentioned being stereotyped with such images as being lazy, as not being more academically motivated, as being sassy, as being ghetto, being disciplined unfairly for the way that they dress, perhaps the way they may wear their hair, and also being viewed and expected to conform to white femininity, right? And so what that means is that within these spaces, Black girls are sort of viewed as less innocent, in terms of how they may speak about issues around problem solving. They're sort of expected to conform to sort of this heteronormativity in how they define themselves. And so there's definitely Black girl voice that's important in this work. And so I'm just trying to capture that in this moment.
Oh, that's amazing work. So, I shared, a little bit, and when I go back and when people really listen to the whole episode, I'll talk about some data around the disproportionate disciplining of Black girls. Mm-hmm. And I think you went to like the root of maybe why there's this over disciplining and over policing, right? This adultification. And I was wondering if you could talk a little bit more about that adultification of Black girls and that intersectionality.
That's right. Yeah. So we know that Black girls are 5 times more likely to be disciplined for minor for minor infractions, right? They're twice as likely to be suspended. And this is pretty much just about how Black girls show up in this space. I've heard stories from some of the participants in my study basically stating that when they came in and they, were dressed a certain way, that it was maybe that security guard or that administrator following them around the building. That they were often treated very harshly and different than their white peers. And so when we talk about adultification, there is some research literature that shows that Black girls are more likely to be viewed older than what they typically are. They're viewed as sassy. They're viewed as problem solvers, to be mediators between teachers and their peers. And so it's almost, it almost replicates this idea when we look at the way in which Black women are expected to be in organizations. And some of that research, when we look at it from an intersectional lens, shows that Black women, older Black women, not necessarily girls, but Black women in these spaces are likely to be the fixer, the Olivia Pope, or the Omarosa. And in these spaces with Black girls, when we focus on Black girlhood, Black girls are getting those same type of messages around, being this mediator and being viewed much older than what they typically are. And it's really unfortunate because this impacts their learning and their well-being.
So can you talk a little bit more about that, Dr. Sheretta, about that impact on learning and well-being, how that's showing up for in these young girls' lives?
Yeah, absolutely. And so we know that if a school system, for example, if not necessarily a school system, but what I mean is a school setting, that classroom setting, if it's not promoting or it doesn't have a healthy school climate, meaning not only for academics, but if it's not also racially healthy in that context, that damages Black girls' learning and their well-being. And in some of my work, I found that if teachers are very supportive, they're affirming in Black girls' identity within that space, if Black girls feel like they have a sense of belonging. And what's interesting about this is that this cuts across the different sort of context that Black girls are in, meaning this can be in a racially, ethnically diverse setting, predominantly Black setting, predominantly white setting. If Black girls feel as if they belong, if they are valued, if their voice is heard, this increases their how they view themselves. They have more racial pride. They have higher rates of academic curiosity, and they also feel like they belong. And so it's something that's very important for us to do to ensure that the environments, particularly school systems that serve our Black girls, are really making sure that we are affirming their identities and not sort of comparing them to this white femininity lens. Because what often happens is that when we bring up the issues of Black girls, they're often compared to Black boys or they're compared to white girls. And so they sort of fall within this idea of being invisible. And so it's important that we center Black girls' voices in these spaces that just sort of allows for them to be, healthy learners, right? So they can make a contribution to society, so they can be more civically engaged, and most importantly, so they can love themselves. And I think affirmation is an important part of that.
Now, some of your work, when we talked earlier, you do work with teachers. You do professional development.
Absolutely.
And are you finding any trends, especially given, the experiences last year with the protest after George Floyd's death, the call for social justice, racial justice, equity, that schools are looking to make some changes or make improvements regarding this area?
Absolutely. I think that there are definitely, so through this work, I work in various types of school districts, right? And so some of these schools have a different racial ethnic composition. And so within those school districts, it can be challenging in some school districts that never had to sort of do this self-reflection until these moments happen, right? As opposed to when you talk to their adolescents, when kids within that setting, they sort of can tell you that these things have been happening. And so I guess the answer to that question, just being transparent, is that some environments are more receptive to that work, while some are still trying to do this work and sort of understanding what is going on in real time. And so it's definitely been an eye opener. Teachers have been wanting this information, but not necessarily knowing what to do about it. Um, sometimes there's resistance to talk about social justice issues and bring them into the classroom. But again, if we sort of center around what a healthy school climate looks like, part of that is affirmation of who's in your classroom. And so that's primarily what this work have looked like. It's been definitely positive, but again, because people come from, have their own lived experiences, come from all of these different walks of life, sometimes that work can be challenging if you've never had to experience it, or you've never been called out in terms of addressing it.
Yeah, and I could definitely see that because I have the lens of being a mom of two black sons.
Mm-hmm.
Historically, I think in things I've read and even my own personal experiences, right? I think I was really ignorant to the fact that there was um, such an area of concern, right, over policing
Mm-hmm.
and over disciplining of Black girls, right? Because you hear so much information about Black boys, right?
That's right.
And
Yeah,
so it's kind of like, well, you don't hear about it, so it's not a problem.
that's right.
So how have you addressed that in your research and also in your profession to make sure that this issue really is brought to the center so that it can be addressed?
Absolutely. And I think that's a great question. And so, one of the things that I just want to make clear is that, when we do this work through my own lens, I've been saying that we have to get rid of our language, which a lot of us scholars have, is this idea of, we want to do the oppression Olympics. Who has it the worst? Is it Black boys or Black girls? And I think that's the wrong lens that, we're using to really assist both populations. I think that Black boys have unique racialized and gendered experiences, and I think Black girls definitely do. And a lot of the invisibility of Black girls is really coming from, and it really stems from Kimberly Crenshaw's work when she talked about, intersectionality and the fact that in some, from the legal studies, in some ways where if Black women experience harassment or discrimination at their place of employment, they had to choose either the race or gender piece, right? But it couldn't be both. And I think more recently we're starting to see, and what I tell folks is that, Black women compromise these two identities, marginalized and oppressed. So that makes these experiences unique. And this also translates to what's happening to Black girls within this setting. And also, I think it's room for both. We can study Black boys and be affirming of their identities and be, acknowledging their own racialized and gendered experiences. But I think we can also do the same thing for Black girls. But we lose that when we do the comparison. And I like to call it the oppression Olympics, when we try to, put folks, put these populations against each other to try to see who has it the worst. I think that's the wrong lens for us to have. But I am very excited and encouraged and motivated that there is an increase of, in terms of visibility for Black girls, that we're now starting to talk about Black girlhood and Black girls owning their own voices and defining who they are. And we're really making contributions, particularly in my area, developmental science, that we're now starting to understand how context, how family, how peers, how school settings shape Black girls' development, by also making sure that we allow them to define who they are.
Oh, that's amazing.
Mm-hmm.
Now you're also a mom, right? You're a mom of girls.
Oh, two girls, yeah.
How does, again, I think it's kind of hard sometimes, I think, to leave work at home or leave work at work, right? And not bring it home, especially when
Yes.
they center around children, center around, being parents, right, of kids of Black children.
That's right.
So I was wondering how has your role as a parent either influenced your work or vice versa, your work influencing your parenting?
Absolutely. I think that's, again, wonderful questions. So one of the things, though, that I even had to do some self-reflection on is the way in which my Black girlhood was, right? And so what I mean by that is that through my K through 12 experience, I am from Detroit. Detroit is a very hyper-segregated city, and our schools were a reflection of it. And so in terms of the affirmation of my identity and who I was, with the help of my parents and the village and the kinship and the extended family and those within the school settings, my identity was always affirmed. And it's not until I had daughters that they're in spaces that are academically different, meaning that they are in spaces where the racial and ethnic diversity looks very different in their schools, and they don't necessarily get those messaging around who they are and how beautiful they are and how wanted they are and how smart they are, because these are predominantly white schools that are high performing schools in the city, but the context is particularly different. And so one of the ways that I had to challenge myself is that, number one, in my work, is that Black girls are not a monolith group. Black girls have different racialized experiences, right? You have Black girls that grew up in rural settings, suburban settings, urban settings. We have Black girls that attend private or public or charter schools, that are in schools that are racially and ethnically diverse, socioeconomically diverse. And so even having these conversations with my daughters, being one of the only friends at the party that have to wear a bonnet, right? When she has a sleepover, and all the questions that she gets from that, that was not an experience that I had. And so with my own work, I am beginning to reimagine Black girlhood, but also recognizing the different lived experiences and the beauty, right, and the depth of what Black girlhood looks like, with my own daughters sort of telling their stories. So that's been amazing. I don't think they would say that, but
Well, I think, hopefully as they get older, right, everything, we kind of
yeah,
look back, right, on our childhood, and then really, really either understand the gift it was, right,
absolutely.
or you can take from it, to help your.
Yeah, because it's interesting because it really wasn't until I watched Amanda Seales' HBO stand-up comedy special that she was talking about her experiences attending a predominantly white school with her friends, and how she sort of always was expected to be the person that always dressed best, that always had the flyest hairstyle, that could rap or dance automatically because she was Black. And so at that moment, the next day, I had a conversation with my daughters, and they were like, yes, that happens all the time. And I was like, wow, like I've never had to sort of deal with that. And so, we're like working through it. I'm learning, but they definitely have sort of sharpened my lens and how I define and look at what Black girlhood is.
And I think that's so important, right? Understanding how our children interpret the world
Hmm.
that they and like you said, everything is contextual, right? We talk about intersectionality,
Right.
but we also talk about context.
That's right.
But what seems like where the dots really connect, right, is how they're socialized or racialized in these settings, right? Educational settings,
Yes. Yes.
and in the broader world. And I talked with you earlier, Doctor. I'm going to speak with Dr. Valerie Adams Bass a little bit more about
Hmm.
how media, right, how that plays, right, these
Absolutely.
how how media has really played into how Black girls are racialized in these settings.
And can I just add one more thing? I just want to talk about the importance of, and so based on those conversations, it not only sort of shaped my research, but it also made me be more intentional as a parent. And so because I knew that the school wasn't affirming their identity in a way that it should have been, I sought out programs within the community that did that to make sure that they were, being very intentional about being in Black girl space. And so that's some of the things that I've also did too, to sort of make sure that they have that, because that's something that I've always had. And so that also so I just wanted to say it was just not only the research, but it was also like a personal, it's something that I did personally for them. Yeah.
And I think, when you talked about your experiences growing up in Detroit. So I grew up in Washington, D.C.
Oh, okay.
I mean, I went to public schools, predominantly Black public schools, had teachers that were Black.
Hmm.
But I mean, for a myriad of reasons, right? I don't think I had this had the experiences that a lot of young girls are having nowadays, right? I think,
That's right.
well, also I grew up in the 70s and 80s, right? So I think that the whole idea of black love and,
Mm-hmm.
gifted in black, right? So there was already this affirmation. My dad went to Howard University,
Sure. Yeah.
Black Power, and so it was different. I think now, though, I think it does exist, but for a lot of kids, I think it's just a different time.
Yeah. Yeah. It's a different time.
It's so different, and even for young girls of color, of black girls who are going to even predominantly black schools, there's this dynamic, right? There are not as many black educators, right? So it's rare to
That's
find
right.
a teacher that's going to look like you.
That's right.
And I don't know if in your research, if that plays a role as well, right? This whole idea of, is this over disciplining also related to the paucity, right? This less likelihood of having a teacher, a black teacher.
I think so. I think, nationally, 80% of teachers are white. And I could speak, are white female teachers. And I think also, I could speak for Missouri, we're up over 90% of majority of the teachers. And I think that that's one of the reasons. And also what some of the research shows is that, black teachers are not only beneficial for black students, but having racially and ethnically diverse teachers benefits everybody because of the lived experience and the opportunity to learn different things. And so I definitely see that show up. And most importantly, I've seen it in my own work where, the counselor, black girls are even talking about if they wish that they had a counselor that sort of knew their own lived experience, that was a person of their racial ethnic group, right? That they felt like could sort of really understand black girlhood and what was going on. Or the fact that teachers might say insensitive things without sort of acknowledging their existence. And so what you talk about, I guess the question you asked really hits on in 2021, what black girls are talking about, right? It's the importance of having someone that looks like them, that can affirm them in these spaces. And this is not only the teachers, but they're requesting this of counselors, of administrators, even of programs, after school programs that serve them. And one of the things that you brought up, I think you were this idea of media, which Dr. Adams Bass would talk about. But a lot of our socialization and messaging about what we think about Black women and girls is through social media. And so I also think that we're contending with another socialization mechanism, which is also sort of feeding into the way that white teachers are perceiving Black girls in context, the way that people are sort of loading up Black girls with these stereotypes. I think media has a lot to do with that as well.
Yeah, and again, what during the research for this episode, just kind of seeing like some of the lines, again, connecting dots, right? So if there's this assumption or stereotype or generalization, right, because of a teacher's, maybe lack of, lived experiences, right,
Mm-hmm.
working with Black children or the experiences with Black children or Black culture potentially, right? So then you have this lens based on your view of only seeing the Black experience through a media lens.
That's right.
And then a young lady acts a certain way, and then, you jump to making assumptions, right? The teacher may jump to making assumptions, and then, calling in, either that child is either then sent to the principal's office or the police, and that's a whole other issue, right?
Right.
Resource officers in school, which can compound an already,
racial, yeah, it just makes it worse. It makes it worse. And, one of the things in this work is that, and I don't know if, I think we were going to get to this, is, people have to, our educators, our teachers, our staff, these school resource officers, we really have to go through some intense training and some self-reflection about what they think about groups, how they're socialized, like what are their, because a lot of these biases and stereotypes contributes to the action, to the disciplinary infractions that Black girls receive, how they're perceived in that environment, and how they're treated. And so a lot of work we also have to do with the adults and the service providers who are there to meet the needs of all students, but somehow they're not meeting the needs of all students.
See, and I think again, yeah, I love having you as a guest, right? Because you're like really deep, and I'm like learning so much. And again, it just processing everything you're saying, right? This is really why systemic racism
Mhm.
and institutional racism really does hurt everybody, right? Because
That's right.
not only does it hurt kids of color, it hurts white educators, white people as well. Because if again you yeah. So how we interact with each other is really based on how these systems are designed. And we need to dismantle these systems.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Because people come with different lived experiences, right? And this is not to say that, we're going to blame white teachers, but it is to say that we have to hold white teachers and people who service our children accountable. That means that you have to take account for your own lived experiences. You have to do some self-reflection. How were you introduced to race and ethnicity, to people that look different than you? What mechanism has that been through, right? How are you socialized? Where are you getting your information from that informs you? And how does that sort of feed into the work that you do every single day with our kids? And so we have to start there as well, because I think that's where a lot of the disconnection is at. And so when I go out to these school districts, I mean, you have people well into their 40s or 50s who've never been challenged to sort of see outside their own lens, because some of them have grew up in that neighborhood. They went to that high school and they came back, and now they're teachers or administrators in that same sterile white setting. And so if your only exposure is kids through a desegregation program and what you've typically heard, then you're going to treat those students a certain way. So it really is about this idea of how we're socialized. Does that make sense?
Yes, it totally makes sense.
Okay.
So in your research, what ways have you found that really would help address the issue of over policing, over disciplining of Black girls in schools?
One of the things I think is that we need to center Black voices. We need to center Black girls' voices. And what does that mean? We use their numbers are great. Numbers are great because we can see the disparities that exist. Like we know that Black girls are 5 times more likely to be disciplined, twice as likely to be suspended. But I also think we have to do and engage in some narrative, some storytelling, allowing Black girls to sort of name and define what their experiences is like every day in a particular context. I also think we need to view it from a strength-based lens. Some of the work, more recently we've become, we're using the strength-based lens, but some of the work with Black girls have been viewed from a cultural deficit perspective. Meaning that, we're just focusing on pregnancy rates. We're focusing on, obesity. Not to say none of those things are not important. I'm not saying they're not important, but I'm saying that if we don't do the work as practitioners or scholars and sort of doing this self-reflection, then the work that we're going to put out is going to tell this sort of cultural deficit narrative. So I think a strength-based lens, centering Black girls' voices, and we need to use methods that honor Black girls' lived experiences. And so what I mean by that is, what theory, and I'm speaking for the social scientists or even educators, what are we using to explain a phenomenon of development? Are we using a one-size-fits-all model that isn't intersectional, that doesn't really, look at the effects of race and gender and class, right? And so that's important as well too. And also the fact that Black girls are not monolith. So there is diversity in socioeconomic status. There's diversity in the school settings. the neighborhood settings that Black girls attend. And so I think if we start there, and I know that that's a lot, but that's just typically, I think, how we can sort of, typically what I see in this work, but also I think how we can sort of continue to make sure that we are allowing Black girls to define and name their own reality. So centering Black girls' voices, viewing from a strength-based lens, and really looking at the research and asking ourselves, are our methods and frameworks honoring Black girls' voices and lived experiences? I think that's a start.
Oh, I think that's a wonderful start. And before we end our conversation today, I'm asking all my guests this year for this particular season to think about how can we reimagine, right? Given the COVID era we've gone through, fight for racial justice, social justice. What are your thoughts about what are the opportunities? How would you reimagine how we can better support Black girls?
Yeah, great question. And so one of the things I think is that we have to get out the four walls of the academy. And what I mean by that is that we have to communicate our work to non-academic audiences, those persons that are on the ground and that serve our Black girls. This is practitioners, social workers, counselors, principals, school districts. We need to offer, translate our research to practice. We need to talk about professional development. And we also need to collaborate with organizations as well. One of the organizations that service girls that I can think of right now is Girls Inc. They're very important. They're important to the community, but they're very intentional about creating Black girl space and honoring their voices. And so I think that if you are a scholar that's engaged in this work, it is very important. It is imperative that you partner with organizations that are on the ground working with our girls, communicating to non-academic audience, those persons who service our population. I think it's so imperative. And it really would help us reimagine how we can better support Black girls because, we have the literature, we have the findings, we also have Black girls' voices. We also know what practitioners are doing with our information. And we can also learn from our community organizations as well about what works and what doesn't work. But I think it's got to be a team effort. It has to be the village. And I think that if we can incorporate these pieces, I think that's how we can better support Black girls.
Thank you so much, Dr. Butler Barnes. This has been a wonderful conversation.
I know. Thank you so much. Anytime it's a conversation around Black girls, I am ready. Yeah, this was amazing. This was amazing. Thank you again for having me.
Next, we continue the conversation with Dr. Valerie Adams Bass. All right, so I spoke with Dr. Sheretta Butler Barnes on the topic of over-disciplining and over-policing of Black girls. And in our conversation, I mentioned that I was also going to speak to you, another, renowned expert, about how really media, right, and media portrayals impact how girls are over-policed and over-disciplined. And I love the question that you posed pre-interview. How do the identities of Black girls get policed? And so I wanted to get your response, also the response based on the research that you've done in this area.
Absolutely. So again, Jackie, thanks for having me. I'm happy to be here and be a part of this conversation, an important conversation to have, particularly thinking about media, because so often we are aware that it's here. Its presence, but we don't really consider the implications until we see some non-fictional assaults that occur, right? And then we start to think about the trauma associated with seeing people, assaulted and killed and murdered by police, women, girls, children. So that was probably a little bit heavy to start out with, but I just want to contextualize that media, is here, especially visual media, So when we're thinking about visual media, in the images of Black women, those images are really what shape how people perceive and come to understand Black girls, unfortunately. So, oftentimes in the literature, where we are speaking about the experiences of Black girl, we talk about the adultification of Black girls, right? So oftentimes that adultification comes from the images that people see, televised images or visual images of women, most often Black women. And then those images are used to interpret the behaviors and expressions of Black girls, which is unfortunate. So you do have not just the adultification because of the need to socialize girls, racially socialize girls and prepare them to navigate racial structures and systems, but the adultification because oftentimes these media images, which often reflect or project negative media stereotypes about Black women, are the images that people use to make meaning and understand Black girls.
So based on your research, right, how do we make that leap, right? How is that leap from how we perceived or how Black girls are perceived in the media? How does that then translate or end up, right, where Black girls are over policed and over disciplined?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And I think it's a leap that we are sometimes unconscious of. So, of course, there's the Harvard implicit bias test and other tests that look at racial bias, skin color bias, gender bias, etc. But I do think that for some, when it comes to media, particularly media of Black people, Black women, and Black girls, it's not even a conscious decision. I would say I would love to see like a media-based bias test come out. Maybe I'll do that in my next phase of my career. But I say that because, for example, I was talking with a young lady, and she was speaking about how when I used to do applied work and work in the field, about how her teachers responded to her based on what they are seeing in pop culture. And what we know, the leap comes from pop culture often romanticizes, if you will, as well as makes extreme images of Black women, right? And they're usually these sapphire images, which now the term is ratchet, right? And depending on who you speak to about these terms, so a sassy Black woman who talks loud, who is demoralizing to Black men, who is just disrespectful of others, right? So that's sort of this historical sapphire image. So then you fast forward today to ratchet or ratchetness. And while some say, we have come to accept that term and turn it on its head and make it something it isn't, really when you have people who don't have that cultural context, often white educators or white therapists and doctors, and all that they see is these images projected that are, Black women being loud, Black women being rude, Black women fighting with one another, particularly when we're talking about reality television, then what you find is that perception is then, Black girls are thought about in that way, right? As well as, so it's not just that we're thinking about, or people are thinking about Black women. So there's a need to suppress their voice, right? And to control their bodies. And if we think about that historically, we can think about slavery as a place where Black women's bodies were, right, suppressed and also exploited. And so it's a long legacy, and that legacy really does continue when we look at how media images that are celebrated and receive the most marketing and support in the industry.
Yeah, I mean, the more, again, the more that you're speaking to this issue, I mean, everything sort of is like, is the dots are connected. And, as I discussed before, there's plenty of data and anecdotes about experiences of Black girls in our media, right? We've seen images of them being policed, right?
Absolutely.
Or over disciplined. And this idea of this cultural competency of our educators and even our, like you said, the other systems, the judicial system, criminal justice system. And, it makes me wonder, it's like, should that be, a standard, right? That there really is this cultural competency. It's not just an implicit bias course, but an understanding. And then I think about like, how complex that is, right? Is that cultural competency really a class that says, forget about everything you've seen on television, right? Or your one interaction with that, that one person, so that you have to be untaught all these negative stereotypes.
Yeah, I think there are a couple of things to be said. This is such a big topic, and it may sound like a leap or a jump. So I do want to share a few things. So, a few things to share and to think about as it relates to, the policing of Black women and Black girls, which is the topic of this. And so how then they are suspended and literally policed and become part of the adjudication system or juvenile justice system. You want to think about, really the beauty ideals, right? So beauty ideals, American beauty ideals, have really been based on meekness and white women and meekness. And that has been the standard of beauty and the ideal. It isn't until more recently, and I talk about this in a couple of my chapters, it isn't until more recently where you begin to see more Rubenesque, if you will, white women in television shows celebrated as musical artists. Prior to that, you didn't really see that phenotypic diversity among white women, and that has been the ideal in media. So the alternative or alternate for Black women is much more diverse. It's phenotypically diverse. If you think about sitcoms, maybe the characterizations aren't diverse. So you might see, a Mammy, you might see a Sapphire, but it's phenotypically diverse. There's usually someone who's overweight or what we might consider obese or chubby. There's slim. There are all different kinds of body types of Black women in televised media and dramas and movies, big screen movies, what used to be big screen before COVID-19, and also as a musical artist, right? So you do get an opportunity to see this phenotypic variety. And what my research has shown, and one of the projects that I'm working on now, we've seen that Black girls tend to have, and other researchers' work has shown this, Black girls tend to have a higher self-esteem and a higher self-concept than all of their other peers. So compared to white teen and young adult girls, compared to Latino, Latinx, younger girls and adolescents, compared to Asian American, compared to all other ethnic groups, these girls tend to have higher self-concept and self-esteem. And my early study, and one of the things we're digging back into now is the focus groups. We saw that, these girls tended to prefer televised media or visual media images that represented or showed diverse representations of Black girls. So when you're talking about like this alternate image and undoing and learning, Black girls do get that. Right. And then the racial socialization messages that are communicated to them about their beauty from both their mothers and their fathers also play a part in the idea of, self-concept and beauty, what the ideal beauty is. I would be remiss not to talk about, I have a chapter coming out, really another media chapter coming out that's geared toward white women who teach Black girls, right? Teaching beautiful, brilliant Black girls. And in that chapter, that's the name of the text. And in that chapter, one of the things I talk about is, the chapter is a matter of media, cultural appropriation, and expectations of Black girls. So what I do talk about in relation to beauty in that chapter is that right now in this cultural moment, what we're finding is that those aesthetics that were historically preferred within the Black community are now really being commodified by non-Black women, like the Kardashians, right? So whereas before having, large hips, having full lips was considered non-attractive in mainstream communities, now you find that there are non-white women commodifying that aesthetic that was before a preferred aesthetic that was celebrated within the Black community.
Yeah, I can definitely see that. And I love how, your work is really, again, you're translating your research into things that are practical for educators. And I hope that, many more educators will have the opportunity to read that information. And again, as part of this continued journey about how do we look at implicit bias and how does it form, right? And I think what's even more striking is, when we talk about racism impacting communities of color. I think these are examples of how racism impacts everyone, right? Because if the norm is meek, blonde, white, and you don't fit that mold, then that just perverts everything, right? It perverts ideals about who you are as a white person and your ideals of what people of color like, and the same thing for people of color, right? The ideals get perverted because of this white normative quote unquote ideal.
Absolutely.
And it really,
absolutely,
and it's hurting everybody.
It is, and that's a nervous chuckle, not a joyous chuckle. And I say that for a few reasons. One, this commodification of Black body aesthetics is celebrated among white women, but not necessarily celebrated among Black women. And when we're talking about Black girls, if we want to go back to the everyday Black girl, when Black girls hit puberty, prior to puberty, they're probably about roughly the same BMI, growing at the same rate as non-Black girls. But once they hit puberty, they actually have a heavier bone density. Their bodies tend to mature more quickly. And so going back to my early statement of, seeing visual images of Black women behaving and looking a particular way, when you see a maturing Black girl who has a body that's growing into a woman and more woman-esque, more mature than you would expect for her age, people respond to her. That way, teachers are going to respond to her as if she's more mature because physically she may be more mature, but not necessarily emotionally. And so they're going to respond to her in that way. And even often, girls will speak about also navigating, relationships as their bodies begin to mature during puberty, navigating relationships and people, impressing upon them, this adultification because they're beginning to mature. Males are impressing upon her when we're talking about heterosexual attractiveness or ideals, if you will. So, although these are adolescent girls and young adult girls, people are responding to them as if they're full grown adults, right? Also, there's this idea that, when we're thinking about, as you said, this ideal of meekness and being quiet, culturally, this is where context matters. We're not necessarily quiet, right? We are an expressive people. When you think about, the verve, how we speak, how we communicate, how we walk, that is within the Black community, while there's diversity, we generally are expressive people. And Black women tend to be expressive. So Black girls are expressive, right? So if we think about, Bandora's social learning theory, Black girls are going to learn from the Black women whom they are modeling and see. So if they see Black women talking among each other and having a good time and speaking out, then that too will become a habit for them. But if the expectation is that girls are going to be more quiet, right, and that they are not going to speak out or speak loud or speak out of turn, then when they're in school spaces or even having encounters with law enforcement officials or officers, the idea that they're going to speak out, speak up, speak back becomes punitive, right? They're punished for using their voice in a way that is not to be expected of any woman, but particularly not favored from Black women and girls, right? So if the beauty ideal is meek, quiet, diminutive, and Black girls, while some may be that way, but many are going to speak out on behalf of themselves and others, then they are going to unfortunately be punished in that way. Right. And so even if you think about going back to media content, sitcoms, you think about, what images come to your mind when you think about these shows that are now in syndication, when you think about, the characters who played on Moesha, right? When you think about the characters who play on One, when you think about, the young adult women who play on Half and Half, all of these shows that are in syndication. So even this younger generation are now seeing these syndicated images of Black girls, right? Black adolescent girls, Black young adult girls. So, it's not just that the Black viewers are seeing this, but non-Black viewers are watching these shows too. And if they don't live in a multicultural environment, if they don't work or attend schools or work at schools where there's a diverse workforce as well as student population, then that is where they're getting their cues. They're learning about Black people, if you will, and Blackness, which we know that Blackness is not, there's not one way to be Black, or should I say, people should know that there's not one way to be Black. Then, that is what they're going to respond to, right? That's what those teachers, that's what those officers, that's what they're going to respond to. And so it's important to consider how we have conversations around what we are seeing, what we are visualizing, and what we are celebrating in the media.
So I wanted to circle back on a couple of points. That there's this intersection for Black girls, not only because they are Black, right, their racial identity, but also their gender.
Mm-hmm.
And I wanted to see if you could talk a little bit more about that intersection. And even in some places, reading your work, even ethnicity, right? Because again, there's nowhere to be Black. So you can identify as Black in the United States, but be from the Caribbean or be from African countries or a European country.
Mm-hmm. And you could also, and also you could be biracial, right?
Correct.
Right. So these identities carry with them cultural context and how we interpret womanhood and expressiveness. And so I think, and how we respect and honor women. That's the other thing. These identities come with an understanding of women's place in society and how we honor and respect women and how we honor and respect girls or not, right? So I think about, we were recently doing a research project, the changing face of race, looking at the experience of Black immigrant students. So whether they were first and second generation from, as you said, an African country, a European or a Caribbean country. And, there was one young lady from an African country who was part of our study who spoke about how in school for her, adjusting to public education in America meant that there was more discussion and autonomy around her gendered identity than it would be at home, which was an interesting perspective in that. And what she meant by that, she gave examples in that. And in health classes and physical education classes, they had sexual education classes, and they talked about, girls' rights and women's rights, where ordinarily, the country she had come from, there was no discussion or expectation of rights for women and girls, right? So that's a very different experience than a Black girl who has been raised in the United States, multi-generation, who's had to navigate racialized experiences, who has seen her mothers and her aunties and her grandmothers navigating racialized experiences that are associated with her gender or associated with her physique, right? So the clothes that she may choose to wear to work, or the way she styles her hair, that's a very different conversation, right? Because those girls have had to see their mothers and other women in their extended family navigate spaces where their physical selves were either intimidating or different. And so work to either celebrate that in spite of, or work to adjust, right? And adopt mainstream presentation so that they could be successful in their workplace, or so that they could be successful as they move through academic arenas.
Oh man, yeah. So it's very complicated.
It gets very complicated, and I think that Lauren Mims, who's a burgeoning scholar and does all of her work with girls. I work with girls and boys. I don't I work with both. But her study, one of the things she talks about, again, going back to this idea, even for Black girls, when she was working with them, one of her more recent publications, one of the things she mentions is that these girls relate to Black female artists as models for motivation, coping, and navigation. Again, so they're looking at Black adult women as models and motivation. And I think part of that is the limited number of Black female youth, adolescents, or young adults that we see in the media, or that are celebrated. And so they are going to look to Black women, the Black women that they know, and then the Black women that are celebrated in the media. So you're going to see Black girls look to Beyonce, right? You're going to see Black girls look to now Megan Thee Stallion. You're going to see Black girls look to these kinds of artists because these are the kind of artists that are celebrated and in this current time, in spite of some of the racialized context and extreme experiences that we've been having more recently, these artists have become crossover artists, right? So whereas before they may have been a genre relegated to a Black listening audience or Black viewing audience, they are crossover artists, and they are commodified in a way that non-Black viewers and consumers are paying attention to their music, paying attention to their looks, and they're engaging with them in that way. So that's what you know of a Black woman or Black girl, then you're going to engage with those students in your classroom that way, which isn't. And then, we know that there are those who don't favor what Megan Thee Stallion represents. We know that there are those who don't favor what a Nicki Minaj represents. But either way, we and young girls have to navigate those relationships. So that's really important to think about and to consider. And one of the things that I want to press upon is that media socialization is not a new term, it's not a new definition, but we hadn't really been thinking about it very much until we started to see this explosion of social media. But we've got to really think about media as a socializing agent, and that it independently can stand on its own to teach people, if you will, not just the young people, but the adults who work with them, about another group or culture. But when you're leaning on media so much, there's no context.
Whoa.
Right? There's no context for, why Megan Thee Stallion is Megan Thee Stallion, right? There's no context. So what your understanding and interpretation of a stallion is probably not the understanding and interpretation that within group has, right? So that is an appreciated term. But if you have a different perspective, you may be interpreting that differently. So we have to think about the context that's absent from the celebration of these images. And then what does that mean when you're using that as a reference for managing, policing? What does that mean? So when we're talking about Black girls and their bodies, and we have non-Black viewers or listeners paying attention to Black artists that are celebrated and have made crossover status, such as a Megan Thee Stallion, what does it mean when that becomes the reference for managing, communicating, and developing relationships or controlling and policing Black girls?
So based on all your research and experience, right? So my question about, reimagining, right? So how would you reimagine, right? A better way to support, affirm, and protect Black girls?
Critical media literacy. And I know that was almost an alliteration. So I want to use an example and talk about that. So at one point, I was working with a Children's Defense Fund Freedom School with a non-Black colleague who was we were serving as co-coordinators. And this is really important about the messaging that comes from external groups, as I was just describing, but also within group. So every year, there's a part of that program is an end of year celebration. And this is a long way of getting to your answer, but I'm going to tell a story which is part of the Black American or even African tradition. So it was time for us to choose a song. This was an elementary school, right? Elementary school, kindergarten through sixth grade, Freedom School summer program. And the co-coordinator, beautiful voice, very pretty voice, sang, had been working in the community, perceived that she knew more about this community than I did. This was a working class to lower class community of Black children and families. And, she had been working there longer and knew more than I did. Okay, great. So she wants to sing R. Kelly, I Believe I Can Fly. And I talk about this in the chapter that I mentioned that's coming up in teaching brilliant, beautiful Black girls. And I said, no. We argued, not in front of the young people, but we really disagreed about singing I Believe I Can Fly. She really wanted to sing I Believe I Can Fly and have the young people sing I Believe I Can Fly. There were just as many girls as boys in this program. I would say we were almost 50-50 or 47-53, which is pretty good for an out-of-school time program in the community. I was very adamant that we don't sing I Believe I Can Fly, and she couldn't accept me and trust my internal knowledge, right? This context that matters. So I took some time to explain to her that at the time he was being investigated for, sexual relationships with underage girls. And I did not think that that was a good model for us to encourage Black young girls and boys to sing the song. What message were we communicating by celebrating this artist who was under investigation for improper sexual misconduct with underage girls? She still wanted to sing the song. Beautiful song, motivational, that doesn't matter, right? So this is that context part. And that devaluing of the experiences of Black girls and how when we celebrate others at their expense, it can have damage. And so we didn't sing the song. We didn't agree. We got through the rest of the summer, and we're respectful of one another, but we didn't sing the song. And then I think about, and then fast forward and here now with the Me Too movement, R. Kelly is persecuted, prosecuted. Stories are coming out. People are coming to the table saying exactly what happened. So imagine if we had those young girls sing that song. So within the community, before his experience was mainstream, we knew that R. Kelly was being investigated, but she didn't. And even informing her that this could be a problem and we should avoid it for the sake of the girls and boys in the program, it was dismissed, right? So even when we're thinking about music and what can we do, my point is we have to do our homework and we have to be critical media consumers. So critical media consumers mean we understand and we are critical of the media that we're consuming, and we start to dig beneath the surface to figure out who is producing, who is consuming, what kind of conversations can we have with the students in our classroom to be reflective, which is why I love the Strong Black Girls book as well, where we have these reflective questions, to be aware of when I watch this music video, when I watch this movie, how does that relate to my perceptions or understanding of Black girls? Are there alternatives? And even, the idea, I talk about this frequently, the last day of class last fall, we were all tired. My Monday night's class was always tired, even at the beginning of Monday. So I always say, how was your weekend? How are you doing? How are you feeling today? Especially during COVID-19. I said, what did you do this weekend? So I said, well, did anyone see, Megan Thee Stallion on the music awards? Everybody's face lit up. Everyone started singing Body Yaddy. Hey, we're ready then. Okay, I'm shaking out of my tiredness, my fatigue. I just, they were happy and were commenting on Megan and what it meant to have her sing that song and what it meant to see dark-skinned Black girls dancing and this platform. It was an interesting, just how are you doing? Did you see Megan Thee Stallion, right? So if you're talking with younger girls, high school or middle school age girls, who are also most likely seeing Megan Thee Stallion, listening to the uncut version, they've heard WAP, they've heard it all. They've heard Body Yaddy. They've heard all of them. How can you have a conversation with them, a both and conversation? And that requires you to be more literate consumers, to learn more about the artists that you're celebrating or choosing to connect with your students, because it is a good way to connect with your students when you understand what they're watching, reading, listening to, what social media platforms they're using the most, and what's trending. That's a very good thing. But can you go beneath the superficial surface, right? This idea of, the commodified Black identity that we're seeing in these visual spaces, and have a deeper conversation. And that's going to require that you be a critical consumer of media. It doesn't mean that you stop connecting. What it means is that when you do connect, that you're going to be able to have a conversation about body positivity, but also about how, certain parts of the body are celebrated or not, right? And what does that mean for you if you have a similar physique and people respond to you in a particular way? Are there things that you can say or do to cope with people who respond to you in a particular way? So critical media literacy is an important part of that. And when we think about racialized, I like to call it racial media literacy, because oftentimes, while you may be celebrating, or within group may be celebrating a Megan Thee Stallion or another artist or Nicki Minaj, there's another group on the internet who is putting out some negative messages and negative memes about these women and these girls that you celebrate. And, Brandisha Tynes and her colleagues have done some work to look at, the trauma that comes along with seeing racialized media images, both those fictitious and non-fictitious images. So repeatedly seeing, the murder or the, tasing of someone over and over in your social media streams, being in social media platforms with non-Black youth who use the N-word and other words to describe Black people. So what does it mean? And what her research has shown is there's trauma associated with that. So as adults and parents and educators and clinicians who work with these girls and can connect in that way, we have to, become critical consumers such that we can connect with them about the latest movie or the latest video, and we can have a deeper conversation. And in the focus groups that I was recently coding with one of my undergraduate students, she's great. I love working with her. I'm glad to have her in my lab. We were talking about how the girls in this focus group, young adult women, college-age women, were moving from the commodification of the Black identity, right? Being aware when they're in mixed communities or mixed environments, how people are responding to those images and endorsing or not those images. But also they moved from that to talking about colorism within the group. What does it mean to have certain Black women celebrated when other Black artists are not as celebrated? And you can see that along the color lines. And then for them, what that means socially, when they can identify where they fit along those color lines and identify how people communicate and respond and react to them. So I do believe that, critical media literacy means that you have to learn a little bit more about the context, and that you have to be willing to have those conversations. And when conversations are inappropriate, that you have to be willing to do more to have a more diversified imagery in your classroom or in your office or your clinical space, where it might be those who are celebrated, but those who are not as often celebrated. So they have a more balanced images that are reflected or part of the lesson or part of the discussion.
Oh, as always, Valerie, you are amazing. And I thank you so much for sharing your gifts, talent, and treasure with us today. Oh, I'm okay. It was awesome. Awesome.
Thank you.
Well, that's all for today's episode of What is Black. Thanks for listening. And thank you to Doctors Butler Barnes and Adams Bass for joining me today. They shared great information and ideas of how we can better support Black girls. Our Black girls matter, and they must be seen, protected, uplifted, and affirmed. Links to their work and resources for this episode will be posted on our website at whatisblack.co. Music and editing by Manni Simon. Make sure to subscribe to the podcast wherever you listen to podcasts so you never miss an episode. And to stay up to date, sign up for our newsletter at whatisblack.co. Until next time.